The man in the basement of the Silver Hill Listening Post, a squat brick outbuilding on the edge of Washington, D.C., had been on shift for 6 hours, and the wax-coated aluminum disc on his cutting lathe was beginning to drift. He was an FBIS monitor. His job, as of April 1948, was to sit in a wooden chair with heavy brown Bakelite headphones clamped to his ears and listen to Radio Moscow as it came skipping across the Atlantic on shortwave. The signal pulsed and faded like a heartbeat, sometimes clear, sometimes buried under the electric hash of the ionosphere, and when a Russian announcer said something that sounded important, the monitor was supposed to lower a sharpened stylus onto a spinning disc and cut a groove. The disc would travel to a translator. The translator would type an English summary. The summary would be teletyped to Washington, and somewhere in a paneled office overlooking the Potomac, a man with a security clearance would read it and decide whether anyone in the White House needed to know. That was the theory. The reality was that the cut disker was heavy, loud, and unforgiving. Each blank held roughly 15 minutes of audio. Each cut was permanent. No rewinds, no edits, no second chances. If the monitor sneezed, or if a thunderstorm over Ohio blanketed the signal with static, the disc was ruined and another one had to be slid onto the platter while the broadcast kept moving. Stalin's voice did not wait. The announcer reading the latest denunciation of the Marshall Plan did not slow down so an American with a sharpened needle could catch up. And the discs themselves were a nightmare. They were brittle, they warped in heat. A single monitoring station could burn through 50 or 60 blanks in a day. The wax shavings piled up in a little hill beside the lathe, and by the end of a shift, the monitor's fingertips were black with graphite and coated in a grit that smelled faintly of kerosene. That April, the Soviets began jamming Voice of America's Russian language broadcasts in earnest. Stalin had decided that the American voice, beamed across his borders since February of 1947, was a weapon, and he was going to blunt it. The Cold War had entered its radio phase, a war of signals and silences, of announcers in New York reading scripts in careful Moscow-accented Russian, while somewhere east of the Urals, 10-kilowatt jammers howled them into noise. Washington had a problem. To fight a war of words, you have to be able to hear the other side's words. And in 1948, the United States could hear the Soviet Union. It simply could not keep what it heard. That is the gap this story lives inside. A gap about 1 inch wide, wound onto a plastic reel, coated in powdered rust.
Commercial recording in April 1948 meant one of three things. It meant the lacquer transcription disc, 16 inches across, cutting at 33 1/3 revolutions per minute, holding about 15 minutes of audio per side. It meant wire recording, a filament of steel thinner than a human hair, running at 24 inches per second off one spool onto another, prone to snapping, prone to tangling into what engineers called a bird's nest that could take an hour to unpick. Or it meant the cylinder-based dictation machines used in Washington offices, toys really, compared to what broadcasting demanded. None of these would do for what the FBIS and the new Central Intelligence Agency actually needed. They needed to record hours of Radio Moscow, Radio Warsaw, Radio Prague, Radio Bucharest, and a dozen clandestine transmitters scattered across the new communist bloc every single day, with enough fidelity that a translator could pick out accents and proper nouns and the hesitations that might mean the announcer was reading from a corrected script. They needed a medium that did not yet exist in America, at least not at scale. The Germans had built one. By 1941, they had perfected a system that would stun the engineers who finally encountered it 4 years later. A spool of plastic tape coated with a fine suspension of iron oxide particles running at 77 centimeters per second passed a recording head the size of a sugar cube. They called it the magnetophone. It could record 30 minutes on a single reel. It could be edited with a razor blade. It produced a sound so clean that a listener could not tell the difference between a live orchestra and a playback. In April 1948, the engineers at Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing, a company in St. Paul that had spent 3 decades selling sandpaper, were standing in a coating room on Bush Avenue trying to figure out how to make it by the mile. Minnesota Mining and Manufacturing had been founded in 1902 in Two Harbors, a port town on the western shore of Lake Superior, by 5 men who wanted to mine corundum. The corundum turned out to be a low-grade mineral called anorthosite, useless for abrasives, and the company nearly went bankrupt before anyone made a dollar. It survived by moving to St. Paul and by pivoting, repeatedly, painfully, from mining into coatings, sandpaper. Waterproof sandpaper for the automobile industry, invented in 1921 by Francis Oakey. Masking tape, invented in 1925 by Richard Drew. Cellophane tape, electrical tape, reflective tape for road signs. By 1945, 3M's core competence was not any single product, it was a process. It was the ability to take a flexible backing, paper, cloth, plastic film, and coat it uniformly at high speed with a slurry of fine particles suspended in a binder. The company's coating lines in St. Paul ran tape through at hundreds of feet per minute, drying it under banks of infrared heaters that kept the building at a perpetual 95 degrees Fahrenheit in summer. The workers called it the oven. The smell was resinous and sharp, like varnish and solvent, and something faintly sweet underneath. The Scotch brand tartan, red, green, and yellow, based on the Wallace clan pattern, had been adopted in 1945. A cartoon character named Scotty McTape went on the boxes in 1946. This was not a defense contractor. This was a company that sold housewives cellophane tape for wrapping Christmas presents, and whose most recent corporate milestone was figuring out how to put a dispenser with a serrated blade on the side of the roll. And yet, 3 years earlier, someone inside 3M had made a decision that would change everything. If the Germans could coat plastic tape with iron oxide and make it record sound, so could Minnesota Mining. The company had the coating lines, it had the chemists, it had 30 years of institutional knowledge about how to make particles stick to a moving substrate without clumping, without shedding, without cracking when the tape was flexed. What it did not have was iron oxide of the right kind, a binder that would hold the particles in place, or, most critically, any clear idea whether anyone in America would buy the stuff once it was made. They decided to find out. The knowledge itself came home in a duffel bag. In July of 1945, a U.S. Army Signal Corps officer named John T. Mullen, everyone called him Jack, was dispatched to investigate a rumor that the Germans had been trying to jam Allied aircraft ignitions with directed high-frequency radio beams. The rumor led him to a concrete bunker on Feldberg Mountain, north of Frankfurt, where he found 2 diesel generators, a bare antenna tower, and nothing else of interest. What he also found, standing in the rubble with him, was a British officer. The 2 men got to talking about music. The British officer asked Mullen if he had heard the magnetophone the Germans were using at Radio Frankfurt. When Mullen said he thought he had been junking captured magnetophones in Paris for months, machines that recorded with DC bias and sounded like telephones. The British officer shook his head. Not those. Go to Bad Nauheim. Go to the resort town in the hills. The radio station has moved there to escape the bombing, into a castle, and they have a machine that will astonish you. Mullen went. The station had been moved into a castle to escape the bombing of Frankfurt and was being operated by the Armed Forces Radio Service. A German sergeant, still wearing the uniform of a defeated army, clicked his heels and sent an assistant running for a roll of tape. The tape was loaded, the machine was switched on, and Mullen, standing in a castle in a resort town in a country that had surrendered 2 months earlier, heard a playback so clean that he could not tell it from a live performance. He later wrote that he flipped. There simply was no background noise. He looked at the schematics. He saw what the Germans had done, an elegant trick of adding a very high-frequency AC signal to the recording current, a technique called AC bias that aligned the magnetic particles on the tape without saturating them. The Germans had been using it since 1941. The Americans had patented the concept in 1921 and then forgotten about it. Mullen got permission from the Army to send home for personal use 2 magnetophone K4 transports, some spare recording heads, and 50 reels of blank tape. He disassembled the machines and shipped them to his mother's house in San Francisco. German patents were invalidated after the surrender, The technology became, in the antiseptic phrase of the period, spoils of war, free for American industry to copy. But copying it was not the same as building it. You could own the blueprints to a cathedral and still not know how to quarry the stone. A single FBIS monitoring station, operating around the clock on 3 frequencies, produced roughly 72 hours of continuous audio in a single day. Across 20 monitoring bureaus worldwide, listening to Moscow, Prague, Warsaw, Budapest, Sofia, Bucharest, Tirana, Belgrade, Beijing, and a dozen clandestine transmitters whose locations were still being triangulated. The daily output was on the order of 1,400 hours. A year of recording at that pace required more than 500,000 hours of usable medium. Recorded, indexed, stored, and available for retranslation when a senior analyst wanted to check a detail that hadn't seemed important the first time. Lacquer discs could not do it. A single station would consume 250 blanks a day, stacked in cabinets that had to be shelved in climate-controlled rooms because acetate warped in heat. Wire recording could not do it either. The reels were finicky, the splices were ugly, and a broken wire could take an hour to repair and still never sound right afterward. The only medium that could do it was the medium the Germans had perfected and the Americans did not yet manufacture. And the timeline was brutal. Radio Moscow was broadcasting in roughly 50 languages by 1948. The Soviet Union was standing up jamming stations from the Baltic to the Pacific. VOA's Russian programming had been on the air for barely a year. The Central Intelligence Agency, founded by the National Security Act of 1947, needed open-source intelligence. It needed to read in English what Pravda had read aloud in Russian the night before, and it needed it yesterday. Stalin had, in the previous 3 years, blockaded Berlin, engineered a communist coup in Czechoslovakia, consolidated Eastern Europe under Soviet control, and stood up a nuclear weapons program that would test its first device the following year. Every one of those actions had been preceded and accompanied by radio traffic. The announcements, the denials, the subtle shifts in vocabulary that signaled a new party line, they all went out over the airwaves, and every one of them could have been captured if only there had been something to capture them on. There wasn't. Not in quantity. Not yet. A single FBIS monitoring station, operating around the clock on 3 frequencies, produced roughly 72 hours of continuous audio in a single day. Across 20 monitoring bureaus worldwide, listening to Moscow, Prague, Warsaw, Budapest, Sofia, Bucharest, Tirana, Belgrade, Beijing, and a dozen clandestine transmitters whose locations were still being triangulated, the daily output was on the order of 1,400 hours. A year of recording at that pace required more than 500,000 hours of usable medium. Recorded, indexed, stored, and available for retranslation when a senior analyst wanted to check a detail that hadn't seemed important the first time. Lacquer discs could not do it. A single station would consume 250 blanks a day, stacked in cabinets that had to be shelved in climate-controlled rooms because acetate warped in heat. Wire recording could not do it either. The reels were finicky, the splices were ugly, and a broken wire could take an hour to repair and still never sound right afterward. The only medium that could do it was the medium the Germans had perfected and the Americans did not yet manufacture. And the timeline was brutal. Radio Moscow was broadcasting in roughly 50 languages by 1948. The Soviet Union was standing up jamming stations from the Baltic to the Pacific. VOA's Russian programming had been on the air for barely a year. The Central Intelligence Agency, founded by the National Security Act of 1947, needed open-source intelligence. It needed to read in English what Pravda had read aloud in Russian the night before, and it needed it yesterday. Stalin had, in the previous 3 years, blockaded Berlin, engineered a communist coup in Czechoslovakia, consolidated Eastern Europe under Soviet control, and stood up a nuclear weapons program that would test its first device the following year. Every one of those actions had been preceded and accompanied by radio traffic.
The announcements, the denials, the subtle shifts in vocabulary that signaled a new party line, they all went out over the airwaves, and every one of them could have been captured, if only there had been something to capture them on. There wasn't. Not in quantity. Not yet.
The 3M coding room was a long, low-ceilinged building filled with the smell of toluene and methyl ethyl ketone and the faint metallic bite of iron oxide dust. The floor was painted concrete. The machines ran on overhead belts driven by electric motors that hummed at 60 cycles per second, a note just below middle C, audible in the bones of anyone who stood there for a full shift. The coating was applied through a reverse roll system, a rubber-covered cylinder rotating in a trough of pigmented slurry, transferring a precisely metered film onto the passing web of acetate. The slurry was the color of dried blood. Workers wore cotton gloves and cloth aprons that turned rust brown within a week of use, and no amount of laundering would ever get them fully clean again. The solvent fumes were strong enough that the company installed exhaust fans every 20 feet along the ceiling. Many of the workers on the coating lines were women. The Second World War had drawn them into the St. Paul plants, and unlike at some defense contractors where women were pushed out after VJ Day, 3M kept them. Women ran the slitting machines, which cut the broad coated sheets into quarter-inch wide ribbons, each one wound onto a 7-inch reel. The slitters were dangerous. A strip of tape moving at 200 feet per minute can slice through a fingertip, and the workers wore leather finger cots and kept their hair tied back. The production numbers scaled quickly. In 1947, 3M's magnetic tape output could be measured in thousands of reels per month. By 1950, it was measured in tens of thousands. By 1955, the St. Paul plants were producing tape faster than the broadcasting and government customers could consume it, and 3M had expanded into videotape, data tape, and the first computer storage tapes used by IBM and Univac. By the early 1950s, substantial volumes of Scotch tape were being shipped to the Foreign Broadcast Information Service, to the Armed Forces Security Agency, the predecessor of the NSA, and to the military monitoring services that had proliferated after the war. The Silver Hill Station outside Washington, the Key West Station, the London Bureau, the Okinawa Bureau, the Vienna Bureau, all of them transitioned from disc and wire recording to magnetic tape during the late 1940s and early 1950s. The volume of audio the United States could capture, store, and analyze increased by something like 2 orders of magnitude in 5 years. It is difficult now to imagine how radical a shift that represented. It is roughly the difference between a single researcher with a notebook and a warehouse of filing cabinets. A tape reel costing a few dollars could hold an hour of continuous broadcast. It could be indexed with a grease pencil on the box. It could be stored on a shelf for decades, and many of those 1950s tapes, now in the National Archives, still play back today.
The Silver Hill Station and the other FBIS bureaus scattered around the world were staffed by linguists mostly, Russian speakers, Polish speakers, Czech, Hungarian, Romanian, Bulgarian, Albanian. Many were émigrés, Central Europeans who had fled the war and then fled the peace, arriving in America with languages the government suddenly needed. They sat in booths with headphones and typewriters, transcribing what they heard. The work was tedious and demanding. A Radio Moscow broadcast might run 45 minutes. The transcriber would listen through, take notes, then play passages back, sometimes 5 or 6 times, to catch a word obscured by jamming or a proper name pronounced with an unfamiliar regional accent. The completed transcript was teletyped to Washington, where analysts in the FBIS building in Roslyn, Virginia, would scan the day's output for anything that mattered. Some of the intelligence that came out of this system was spectacular. When Stalin died in March of 1953, FBIS monitors caught the first Soviet radio announcements of his illness hours before they were confirmed through any other channel.
When Nikita Khrushchev delivered his secret speech in February of 1956, the speech that began the de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union, American intelligence learned about it partly through FBI's monitoring of ripple effects in satellite state broadcasting, before a full text was smuggled out by Israeli intelligence. When Sputnik launched in October of 1957, FBI's monitors in multiple bureaus recorded the Soviet announcements within minutes. The tapes of those broadcasts still exist. They are quarter-inch Scotch tape wound on 7-inch reels, coated with iron oxide, refined in a plant on Bush Avenue in St. Paul, Minnesota. There is a second kind of story worth telling here, and it belongs to the people who ran the recorders. Monitors working in the Vienna Bureau during the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 sat through nights in which the signals from Budapest were weak, pulsing, often cutting out mid-word. The Hungarians were broadcasting in desperation, calling for Western help that would not come. The Americans recorded everything. They stacked the reels in the booth as they went, 20, 30, 40 of them by the end of the week, each one labeled with a grease pencil and the date. They knew they were recording the last hours of a revolution. They could do nothing to save it. They could only preserve it. That, too, is what the tape made possible. Not only intelligence, memory. The first audio archive of the Cold War, captured as it was happening, on a medium that had not existed a decade earlier.
The Soviet Union, for most of the late 1940s, had no domestic magnetic tape industry comparable to America's. The Soviets had captured German magnetophone equipment at the end of the war, some of it literally hauled east from the Reichsrundfunkgesellschaft headquarters in Berlin, along with much of the associated documentation. They took the equipment, they took the engineers in some cases, they took the recordings, including famous Furtwängler performances with the Berlin Philharmonic, which would sit in Moscow vaults for decades. What the Soviets did not do for many years was scale it. Magnetic tape recorders were rare in the Soviet Union before the 1960s. The Soviet industrial base could build jet engines, rifles, and eventually rockets, but the precision coating chemistry required for magnetic tape, the specific grinding of gamma ferric oxide, the formulation of stable binders, the quality control on a substrate uniform to within a few microns, was, for a long time, a gap. Germany, the original inventor of the technology, had been partitioned. BASF in the American and then Allied zone reconstituted itself and became a major tape manufacturer. AGFA, split across zones, struggled. The East German tape industry served the needs of Warsaw Pact broadcasting and never achieved the scale or quality of the American industry. The asymmetry mattered strategically. By 1950, the United States could record, store, and analyze orders of magnitude more foreign broadcast content than the Soviet Union could. The Soviets read Western newspapers and monitored Western radio. They were not blind, but their capacity for large-scale audio archival was limited. American intelligence, by contrast, was building something new, a searchable, indexable, physically manageable archive of the spoken word coming out of every closed society the United States had reason to care about. It was not a decisive advantage, it was a persistent one. Small in any given week, immense over 40 years. 3M would go on to become, by the 1970s, one of the largest magnetic tape manufacturers in the world. Scotch 111 remained in production for 25 years until early 1973. The company moved into videotape in the 1950s, computer tape in the 1960s, and eventually into the proprietary digital mastering systems used by professional recording studios. Jack Mullen went to work for 3M's Mincom division, where he spent the rest of his career helping to set the recording standards that shaped the industry. He died in 1999 in Camarillo, California, at the age of 85. His collection of early tape recorders, including the 2 German magnetophones he had shipped home from Bad Nauheim in 1945, is now at the Pavek Museum of Broadcasting in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, a short drive from the old 3M Bush Avenue plant. The FBIS kept listening. It listened through Khrushchev and Brezhnev and Andropov and Gorbachev, through the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Prague Spring and Solidarity and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Soviet jamming of Western broadcasts finally ended on November 21, 1988, when monitors at the Radio Free Europe station near Munich observed the jamming signals going silent. By that point, tape was going digital. The old reel-to-reel machines were being retired, but the archive, the vast archive of the spoken Cold War, millions of hours on magnetic tape, remained. Much of it sits now in the National Archives and in the digitized collections of the Open Source Center, the successor organization to FBIS. The technology spread in directions nobody in 1948 could have predicted. The same chemistry that let an FBIS monitor catch a Radio Moscow broadcast let a garage band in Liverpool multi-track demo recordings and a computer scientist in Poughkeepsie back up payroll data to a reel of magnetic tape. The same Scotch tape that recorded Stalin's state funeral recorded the Beatles at Abbey Road. The same iron oxide particles that let an analyst in Virginia play back a Radio Budapest broadcast from 1956 let a child in Ohio play Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club on a compact cassette in 1968. A single technology from a single coding plant in St. Paul braided its way through both the secret history and the public history of the 20th century. It did not care what it was recording. Go back, for a moment, to the monitor in the basement of the Silver Hill Station in April of 1948. He is still there, in his wooden chair, with his headphones on and his disc lathe running. The shavings are piling up. Radio Moscow is reading something about the Marshall Plan, and the monitor is cutting into a blank disc that he hopes will not warp before it reaches the translator's office. 3 years from that moment, he will be a different kind of worker. He will sit in the same chair, in the same basement, but the disc lathe will be gone. In its place, on a shelf above the desk, will be a metal rack holding spools of 1/4-inch tape on 7-inch reels. The reels will be coated with a reddish-brown powder that his supervisor has told him, vaguely, is called ferric oxide. When Radio Moscow begins broadcasting, he will push a button. The tape will begin to move. It will move continuously for 30 minutes on a single reel. When one reel is done, he will thread another. At the end of his shift, instead of a stack of brittle discs, he will hand his relief a neat row of small boxes, each one labeled with the date and the frequency and the time. He will not know, because nobody will tell him, that the rust on the tape is the reason the Central Intelligence Agency can now listen to the Soviet Union on a scale that would have been unthinkable 5 years earlier. He will not know that a company in Minnesota that used to sell sandpaper to auto body shops has just become, without fanfare, one of the most quietly strategic industrial assets in the American Republic. He will only know that the new stuff works better, that the boxes stack more neatly, that his fingers at the end of a shift are no longer black with graphite and shellac. There is a photograph easy to picture, even if I have not found it in any archive. A woman at a slitting machine in the Bush Avenue plant in the early 1950s. She wears a cotton apron and a white cap. Her hands, where they touch the tape, are stained a deep rust color, the color of dried blood, the color of the iron in the earth, the color of rust on a gate left out in a Minnesota winter. The tape moves past her fingers at 200 feet per minute. In a month, a year, a decade, some of the tape she is cutting will sit in a Silver Hill booth and record the voice of a Russian announcer denouncing America, and an American analyst will listen to it, and a memo will be written to a president. None of that will happen to her. She will go home at the end of her shift. She will scrub her hands with lava soap and cold water. The rust will come off, mostly, but not quite.